I woke up to the sound of a heart monitor beeping steadily beside me. The room was pale and still filled with antiseptic air and fluorescent shadows. My chest felt like it had been torn open and stitched back by a storm. Breathing was difficult, and every inhale burned my lungs like dry ice. My arms were heavy with IVs. My lips cracked, my throat dry. I couldn't speak, not yet. I wasn't even sure where I was or what had happened. My name is Eliza Marin, but at that moment, I wasn't anyone. I was just a body in a hospital bed trying to remember how to be alive. The images came in fragments: a highway, screeching tires, the sudden slam of metal, my brother Daniel's voice yelling my name, then darkness. I blinked slowly, trying to focus on the shape beyond the glass door of my room. I could barely lift my head, but the shadows were familiar. My parents. They weren't rushing inside. They weren't crying. They weren't even looking at me. They were talking to someone just outside, someone in a white coat. I closed my eyes again, trying to keep still. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be awake. Maybe they didn't know I could hear them. Then I heard my mother's voice, soft, measured, cold. If her heart is still beating, and if she doesn't wake up, would it be possible to use it for Daniel? My breath caught. My chest ached deeper, not from injury, but from something worse, something sinking and hollow. The doctor paused. His voice was firm but hushed. "That's not how this works. Eliza is alive. You cannot just take her heart." My father added, almost as if explaining something obvious. "But Daniel is in critical condition. He might not survive the week without a transplant. She's, well, she was never as strong. You said yourself you don't know if she'll wake up." The doctor cut in again, sharper this time. "We don't give up on a patient because someone else is more important. That's not medicine, that's murder." I stopped breathing. I had to force my eyes to stay shut. I had to stop the tears from giving me away. They were willing to let me die. My own parents. I wasn't even 20. I had barely lived. I had dreams I hadn't spoken out loud, books I wanted to write, places I wanted to see. But they were already writing me off, already planning to cut me open and take what was still beating inside me, to save Daniel. And I realized right then it didn't matter to them whether I lived. Not really. My name is Eliza Marin. I was born 19 years ago in Portland, Oregon, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. According to my mother, the labor was long and inconvenient. She told me once in a tone that wasn't exactly unkind that she missed an important lecture because of me. That's the sort of thing she said often, facts stated plainly without tenderness. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me. He was born on a clear summer morning, and the world, as I was told repeatedly, seemed to light up just for him. Daniel was their first child, their miracle boy. He walked early, spoke in full sentences before age 2, and could do basic calculus by the time he was 10. My parents are both professors. My mother teaches philosophy. My father teaches mechanical engineering. To them, Daniel wasn't just their son. He was the future, their proof that intellect could be inherited and perfected. And me, I was the second draft, quieter, softer, a reader, not a speaker. I wrote poems in the margins of my notebooks and stared out of windows when I was supposed to be solving equations. I didn't rebel. I didn't scream for attention. I just existed in the corners of their lives like an afterthought they never admitted out loud. When I was in 5th grade, I won a regional short story contest. My English teacher was ecstatic and submitted it to the school district for recognition. My mother glanced at the certificate and said, "It's nice you're doing something with all that daydreaming." She didn't mean it cruelly, I think. She just didn't see value in stories. Not the way she saw value in numbers and achievements and awards. Daniel, of course, was exceptional. He was accepted into Stanford with a full scholarship. He interned at some high-profile tech company every summer. At home, his name was mentioned more often than mine, even when he wasn't there. His framed pictures filled the living room. Mine were mostly confined to my room. Still, I didn't resent him, not then. He wasn't unkind. He was polite, busy, brilliant. But he didn't notice much. He never saw the small ways I shrank in our parents' presence. He never heard the silence that followed when I tried to talk about things I loved. And he certainly didn't see the way I stopped trying. I got into college on my own, a small liberal arts school tucked into the green of Oregon's quieter corners. I chose literature as my major, much to my mother's dismay. "You'll end up editing romance novels in someone's basement," she said. I remember laughing weakly, unsure if she meant it as a joke. Despite everything, I was content. Not happy exactly, but steady. I liked my classes. I worked part-time in the campus library shelving books and annotating manuscripts for extra credit. I had a few friends who liked old movies and late-night debates about existentialism and poetry. I never asked my parents for help. I didn't want them to think I couldn't manage. Then came the call. A family trip. One weekend. My mother insisted. She said Daniel was coming home for a rare visit and wanted to do something wholesome as a family. That was unusual. Daniel didn't usually ask for things like that. But I agreed. Maybe because part of me still wanted to feel like I belonged. Maybe because I was tired of saying no. We were driving back from the coast when the accident happened. Daniel was at the wheel. I was in the passenger seat. It was raining, just a soft drizzle, nothing serious. We were talking about a book I was reading. He listened kind of, but kept glancing at his phone on the dashboard. Notifications were lighting up. He said something about a project. Then came the truck. It swerved out of nowhere. Daniel tried to brake, but it was too late. I don't remember the impact. Only fragments. A burst of white. A scream that may have been mine. The sensation of weightlessness before everything went black. And now, here I was, waking up in a hospital bed, unable to move and listening to my parents weigh my life against Daniel's. Their son, their first. Their everything. Me, just a girl. Too soft, too quiet, too replaceable. But I wasn't going to disappear. Not like this. Not silently. The days that followed my awakening were a blur of dim lights, whispered voices, and the steady ache that throbbed through my chest. The painkillers dulled the edges but never erased it. My body felt unfamiliar, fragile, like something barely held together. The nurses were kind but cautious. They never stayed long. My parents visited but not together. Never for more than 15 minutes. They didn't bring flowers, they didn't bring books, they didn't bring Daniel. I wanted to ask about him, but speaking took effort I couldn't yet summon. One nurse, noticing my struggle, offered a quiet answer as she changed the dressing on my side. "He's stable," she said, still in critical condition but responding. "He's strong." Strong. That word again, always used for him. I never heard anyone say I was strong. It wasn't until the third night that I pieced together what had happened. A young resident was reviewing charts outside my door, speaking softly to a colleague. "The girl in 302 Marin," he said. "She's lucky to be alive. Broken ribs, fluid in the lungs, cardiac bruising." And yet her parents were asking about organ viability before she even stabilized. The other doctor said nothing for a long moment. Then finally she murmured, "It's not unheard of in theory. If the patient were brain dead." But she wasn't. She isn't. That's when it clicked. They didn't think I would wake up. And even if I did, they didn't want me to. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be the tragic backdrop to Daniel's survival, the quiet sacrifice no one questioned. I was supposed to make sense of their devotion to him. I was supposed to be useful finally. I lay there for hours that night, staring at the ceiling. Every beep of the monitor next to me felt like a reminder I was alive, and I had to decide what to do with that fact. The next morning, I asked to speak with the hospital's social worker. I whispered it to the nurse during her morning rounds. I didn't say why. I didn't cry or act frantic. I just looked at her with as much strength as I could fake and said, "Please." Something in my voice must have reached her. She paused, nodded once, and said, "I'll page him." Mr. Rains arrived by noon. He looked like someone's favorite Uncle Gray sweater, kind eyes, a small notebook tucked into his coat pocket. He pulled a chair beside my bed and waited until the nurse stepped out before he spoke. "I'm told you wanted to talk," he said gently. I nodded. "But you need to listen carefully." For the next 20 minutes, I told him everything. My voice was thin, my throat still sore, but the words came easily. Not dramatic, just facts. Precise and steady, like lines from a memoir I hadn't realized I'd been writing in my mind for years. I told him I overheard my parents speaking to the doctor. I repeated the exact words my mother had said. I quoted the tone in my father's voice. I mentioned the way they hadn't looked at me, hadn't spoken to me, not really. I told him about the nurse's comment, about the cold clinical way I'd been treated. He didn't interrupt once. He didn't try to explain it away. When I finished, he closed his notebook and asked one question. Do you feel safe around your parents? I shook my head slowly. No. By that evening, everything changed. A formal ethics review was initiated by the hospital. The attending physician who had heard my parents' initial request submitted a statement. The security footage outside my ICU room confirmed they had been present and speaking with staff during the exact time frame I'd described. Mr. Rains moved quickly. Because I was 19, technically an adult, he helped me file for an emergency court order restricting parental access to my medical decisions. Within 48 hours, the court approved a protective order. My medical information was locked. My visitors list was reset. My parents' access was revoked. They tried to come the next morning. Security stopped them at the front desk. I watched from behind the curtain in my room as my mother's voice rose in sharp protest. She's confused. She's being manipulated. That girl belongs to us. Mr. Rain stood beside me, arms crossed, silent. She belongs to herself, he said softly. The next few days felt like stepping into a different life. A strange one, still painful and uncertain, but mine. I started eating again. I asked for a pen and paper. I began writing little fragments, not about the accident, not yet, but about a girl in a forest alone and strong and wild. I didn't know where the story was going. I only knew she refused to die quietly. My parents didn't return after that, but Daniel did. He didn't come into the room. I saw him through the window one afternoon, sitting in a wheelchair at the end of the hallway. A nurse was adjusting something on his chest. He looked different, thinner, pale, but alert. For a brief second, our eyes met. He didn't smile. Neither did I. He mouthed something I couldn't understand, and then the nurse wheeled him away. I never saw him again in the hospital. 3 weeks after the accident, I was discharged. Mr. Rains had arranged for me to stay at a transitional home for young adults estranged from their families due to abuse or medical neglect. It wasn't fancy. The walls were chipped, the food was bland, but it was safe. It was mine. I slept through the first night without dreaming. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to the weight of expectation or the ache of being less than. I woke up to silence, to possibility. I didn't go back to school right away. I finished the semester online slowly in between physical therapy appointments and sessions with a trauma counselor. I got a part-time job at a local bookstore. I read during lunch breaks and saved every dollar. I didn't contact my parents. I didn't tell them where I was. I didn't write didn't call. I changed my number. Changed my last name. Eliza Marin was the girl who almost died, the girl they almost used. She didn't survive, but I did. The hardest part of starting over isn't building something new. It's letting go of the pieces that still cling to you, the names, the places, the silence that grew between people who were supposed to love you. I legally changed my name 6 months after leaving the hospital. It wasn't dramatic, no ceremony, no announcement. I filled out the forms at the courthouse, paid the fee, and walked out as someone else. Clara Vale. Clara was a name I'd always loved, found in a novel I read when I was 12. Vale was my great-grandmother's maiden name, a woman I never met, but whose journals I found once buried in a closet. She wrote poetry about grief and resilience. She signed her name like it mattered, so I took it, not to hide, but to reclaim. Clara Vale didn't flinch when people looked past her. She didn't apologize for being quiet. She didn't need anyone's permission to exist. For the first time, I felt real. The transitional home I lived in wasn't permanent, but it gave me a place to rest while I figured out what came next. I worked at the bookstore, picked up freelance editing jobs online, and slowly earned enough to rent a small room in a shared apartment. I enrolled in online classes to finish my degree. I chose the long way not because I had to, but because I wanted every step to be mine. I wanted to earn everything without their name behind me. Over time, the nightmares faded. I no longer woke up with my heart pounding or reached for a call that wasn't coming. I stopped wondering what they were doing, my parents, Daniel. I told myself I didn't care. Mostly that was true. 4 years passed. I graduated with a degree in literature and a quiet kind of pride. No cap and gown, no family in the audience, just me alone in my room watching the ceremony on a laptop screen smiling. I moved to a city 2 states away, got a full-time job at a small publishing house known for taking risks on new voices. I worked hard, kept my head down, and read everything. I was good at finding what others missed: raw stories, quiet ones full of heartbreak and grit. Within 3 years, I was promoted to acquisitions editor. A year later, I became partner. At 27, Clara Vale co-owned one of the fastest-growing independent presses on the West Coast. It wasn't about success, not really. It was about freedom, about living a life they didn't build for me, about becoming someone they wouldn't recognize, couldn't reduce, and certainly couldn't control. Then one afternoon, as I was reviewing submissions for our fall catalog, a manuscript landed on my desk. It came through our general inbox. No agent, just a simple email with a short query and an attached document. The author's name was Dee Weller. The title read, "The Sister I Never Deserved." I stared at it for a long time. My chest tightened. It wasn't the name that stopped me. It was the voice in the query letter, the way he wrote, the way he phrased things. I hadn't seen it in years, but I knew it. Daniel. I opened the file and began to read. It wasn't a novel. It was a memoir. Raw, unpolished, almost confessional. The structure was uneven, the grammar shaky in places, but the voice was haunting. He wrote about the accident, about the fear, about the silence in the hospital. And then paragraph by paragraph, he unraveled the truth. He admitted he'd heard what our parents had said. That night outside my room, he was in the hallway just around the corner. He'd heard every word. He hadn't been asleep. He knew they were discussing whether to use my heart. He knew I was still alive. He didn't speak. He didn't stop them. And then I woke up. He wrote about the guilt, the shame, the years of silence. He wrote about how our parents had tried to find me, but I had vanished from their world. He wrote about how they turned bitter, how they blamed each other, how they lost the house and eventually everything else. He wrote about trying to rebuild his life and failing. And then he wrote this: "If I could go back, I would speak, I would scream, I would stand between them and the bed, and I would say, 'She matters.' But I didn't. And I've lived with that silence like a second heartbeat ever since." I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I felt hollow, quiet. I read it again the next day, this time as an editor. I marked notes, corrected structure, reorganized chapters. It was a good story, but it wasn't mine, and I didn't owe him anything. I approved the manuscript for publication. I wrote a short note to the author. "This is a story others need to read. We'll publish it under our winter release." I didn't sign it with a name. He didn't know who had read it, who had made the decision. When the book was released, it did well. Quietly at first, then steadily. Readers praised its vulnerability, its unflinching honesty. It sparked conversations about medical ethics, familial loyalty, and the silence that haunts families. A journalist reached out to Dee Weller for an interview. He declined. 3 weeks later, I received a package at the office. No return address. Inside was a letter handwritten. No greeting, no sign-off. Just one sentence. "I hope you know I would take it all back if I could." I folded the letter, once placed it in a drawer, and never opened it again. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had my voice, and I had already used it. I didn't expect the past to stay quiet forever. I'd made peace with most of it, but peace is not the same as closure. Sometimes it whispers through cracks in the walls you've built, old voices, old names, the weight of what you didn't get to say. After the memoir was released, the buzz around it grew. Not viral, but persistent. Book clubs picked it up. Podcasts requested interviews. Someone wrote a long-form article dissecting the ethical dilemma at the center of it, the question no one wanted to say out loud, but everyone thought, would you sacrifice one child to save another? No one ever mentioned my name. I wasn't in the manuscript. Daniel never described me beyond my sister. And yet I was in every line. About a month after the publication, I received a message from a former nurse at the hospital. She had tracked me down through professional networks not to intrude, but to thank me. She remembered that week. She remembered the girl in the ICU with the bruised ribs and quiet eyes. She told me she had heard the conversation, part of it at least, and had stayed up that night unable to sleep. She had carried that moment with her for years, wondering what had happened to the girl in room 302. I wrote her back, thanked her, told her I remembered her kindness, even if I couldn't speak it then. It was the first time I spoke about that week to anyone outside the legal system. Later that night, I sat on my small balcony overlooking the city. It was quiet. The lights flickered below, soft and golden. I wrapped myself in a sweater, cradled a cup of tea, and for the first time in a long while, let myself remember the hospital bed, the weight of IV lines, the feeling of breathing through pain, the echo of my mother's voice asking a doctor if she could take my heart, and how still the world had felt after that. I hadn't spoken to my parents in 8 years, not a word. No letters, no calls, nothing. But silence like glass eventually cracks. One day in early spring, a plain envelope arrived at the office. No return address, no markings. Inside was a letter written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Clara, we don't know where to begin. We are not asking for forgiveness. We know we lost that right, but we want you to know we think of you every day. We have lost everything. The house is gone. Daniel is unemployed. We are getting older and weaker, and we live with the weight of that week like it's carved into us. We were wrong. We are sorry. We hope that maybe, just maybe, you will read this and know that if there is ever a place for us in your life, we will wait. Love. Dad. It was strange seeing the word love from a man who hadn't once held my hand in that hospital. I read the letter once, then again. I placed it on my desk and stared at it for a long time. That evening, I sat down and wrote a reply. It was short. You had a daughter when she was broken unconscious and defenseless. You chose your son. That was your right. But choices come with consequences. I made mine. I live freely now. Please do not contact me again. Clara. I didn't mail the letter. I kept it in a drawer for a week. Then I dropped it in the mailbox 1 block from my apartment. They never replied. Months passed. Then one day, an email arrived from a legislative staff member in Washington state. They had read Daniel's memoir and traced the story to a recent ethics movement in healthcare. A senator was sponsoring a new bill focused on protecting the medical rights of incapacitated young adults from unethical family interference. It had been nicknamed Clara's Heart Bill by aides working on it. They asked if I would consider sharing my experience in a closed session with lawmakers. I said yes. Not for them, not for my parents, but for the girl I used to be, the one hooked to wires listening to people decide whether her life was worth continuing. I flew to Olympia in the fall, sat in a wood-paneled room across from 6 lawmakers and 2 healthcare professionals. I read from a prepared statement. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just told the truth. When I was 19, my parents tried to offer my heart to save my brother. I was unconscious. They didn't think I would wake up, but I did. And I remember everything. They thanked me. One of the senators, an older woman with silver hair and soft eyes, said, "You shouldn't have had to survive that way, but you did. And now others will too." I walked out of the chamber into cool air. The sky was gray, but I felt light. I had spoken, not for vengeance, but for clarity. And that was enough. Healing doesn't happen in one moment. It unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, like morning light moving across a floor. You don't realize how much you've changed until you wake up one day and realize the ache is quieter, the air feels softer, and you've stopped looking back every few steps. After testifying for the Clara's Heart Bill, I returned home feeling different. Not triumphant, not proud, just steady. It was like something inside me had finally settled into place. I wasn't carrying the weight of their decisions anymore. I had set it down not in forgiveness, but in finality. My apartment was small, but bright. One bedroom, a corner balcony walls lined with books I'd carried through every move. The smell of ink and paper was always comforting proof of time passing of lives lived and imagined. At work, I focused on stories that echoed something deeper memoirs from survivors' poetry, from people who'd been silenced novels by first time writers who had no one else to believe in them. I made space for them. I fought for their words to be heard. And in doing so, I found parts of myself I hadn't known were missing. Somewhere along the way, I became more than just an editor. I started mentoring, teaching. I led weekend workshops for young women who'd been through trauma, not as a counselor, but as someone who understood what it meant to rebuild from the inside out. One girl, maybe 16, came up to me after a session and said, "You don't talk like someone who's angry." I smiled. I was, for a long time. But anger doesn't build much. It burns. Sometimes you need it to clear the ground. But after that, you have to plant something else. That was the difference between surviving and living. I'd spent years focused on becoming untouchable, sharp, successful. I wanted to prove that I could rise without them. And I did. But now I wanted something more quiet, more rooted. So I started writing again. Not just editing, not in secret. I opened a blank document and titled it, "A Girl in the Forest." I remembered that image from the hospital. The story I'd tried to write while lying still, heart bruised and soul fraying. The girl who refused to die quietly. I gave her a name. I gave her voice. I let her speak. It was fiction, but not really. It took me 2 years, but I finished the manuscript. And when I did, I sent it to a friend at another press under a pseudonym. I didn't want anyone to publish it out of loyalty. I wanted it to stand on its own. It did. The book was released the following spring. Reviews called it haunting, lyrical, necessary. One critic wrote, "It's a novel about survival, but more importantly, about who gets to decide what survival means." I didn't go on tour. I didn't do interviews. I stayed quiet. But I watched. One afternoon, while shelving books at a local shop, something I still did when I needed to feel grounded, I saw a girl pull the novel off the table and hold it in both hands. She didn't buy it. She just stood there for a long moment, reading the back, flipping through the pages, touching the words like they were familiar. She didn't know who wrote it. She didn't know that I was 2 feet away. But something in her face told me she understood, and that was enough. Not long after the hospital that had treated me all those years ago reached out. They were hosting a private ceremony to honor the staff and patients, whose stories had led to reforms in ethical protocols. They were naming a new wing of their pediatric intensive care unit after the people who had inspired the legislation. They asked if I would attend. I said yes. It felt strange walking those halls again. The scent of antiseptic still lingered. The colors hadn't changed, but I had. Mr. Rains met me in the lobby. He was older, a little slower, but still wore the same gentle smile. He hugged me like I was family. "You look like someone who made it," he said. "I am," I replied. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "No, you made the decision to speak. That's what saved you. The rest of us just followed." At the dedication, a small plaque was unveiled, in recognition of those who remind us that every life is worth fighting for. Clara Vale Advocate, Survivor, Voice. I stood beside it for a long time reading those words, not because I needed validation, but because it was real. It was written. It would stay there long after I was gone. I didn't speak at the event. I didn't need to. Sometimes presence is enough. Afterward, I returned home, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on my balcony. The lake shimmered below, and the city lights blinked like slow heartbeats. I thought about Eliza Marin, the girl in the passenger seat, the girl in the hospital bed, the girl who almost wasn't. And I whispered to the air just once, "You lived," not despite them, but in defiance of what they tried to decide for you. You lived, and you chose how. It happened quietly, like most things tied to the past. Not with a knock at my door, not with a phone call in the middle of the night, but with a resume. I was reviewing candidates for a senior editor position. Our team was expanding, and we wanted someone who could bring a technical background to nonfiction development. I opened a file without thinking, expecting another standard applicant. The name at the top stopped me cold. Daniel Weller. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. For a second, I wondered if it was a mistake, a coincidence. But then I read further, graduated from Stanford, background in engineering, former intern at a company I remembered from the stories I used to hear at dinner tables. It was him. There was no cover letter, just the facts. The neat timeline of someone rebuilding. I stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't know. He didn't know I was Clara Vale. He didn't know the company he was applying to was mine. He didn't know I had read his memoir, had chosen to publish it, had watched it echo into the world and back again. He didn't know I had survived and thrived. He probably thought I had disappeared into the system, changed my name out of shame, or maybe even died. Maybe he hoped I'd moved on and would never look back. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt something colder, distance, like watching someone through thick glass, knowing they can't see you. I forwarded the application to my assistant and said, invite him for an in-person interview. She scheduled it for the following week. When the day arrived, I wore black. Not for drama, but for precision. I took my seat at the head of the conference table, hands folded, voice still. He walked in, briefcase and hand suit pressed but worn. He looked older, thinner than I remembered, less certain. He froze when he saw me. His mouth opened slightly. You, he said. I nodded. Hello, Daniel. He blinked. I didn't know that I was alive. I finished for him, or that I'd be the one across the table. He sat down slowly, as if unsure whether he belonged in the room. You're Clara, he said. I never connected the name. I chose it, I replied, after I chose myself. He swallowed. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his resume. I didn't come here to reopen anything. I just needed work. Things haven't been easy. I raised an eyebrow. No, I imagine not. He looked down. I let the silence stretch. I read your manuscript, I said finally. We published it. His head lifted. I recognized your voice. I thought it deserved to be heard. I didn't know it would reach you, he said quietly. It didn't have to. The story wasn't just about me, it was about you. Your silence. He nodded slowly, shame flickering across his face. I froze, he said. That day, I heard what they said. I didn't believe they would actually. You didn't stop them, I said. That's what mattered. He didn't defend himself. Do you know what it feels like? I continue to be lying in a hospital bed, unable to move, and hear your own mother suggest your heart could be put to better use. He said nothing. You were there, I said. You heard. And you walked away. Tears welled in his eyes. I've thought about it every day since. I stood slowly and walked to the window looking out over the city. I built this, I said, not in spite of you or them, but because I had to, because no one was going to do it for me. He nodded. I understand. No, I said, turning to face him. You don't. You can't. I paused. But I don't need you to. He looked up surprised. I'm not here to punish you, I said. This interview is over. You won't be hired. Not by me. Not here. He swallowed hard. Are you going to tell others no? I don't need revenge. I don't need anything from you. He stood slowly, gathering his papers. You're ruining my last chance, he said. I tilted my head. No, you ruined mine years ago. But I survived. You still can too. He left without another word. I watched the door close behind him and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I felt no triumph, only relief. Some stories don't need a dramatic ending. Sometimes just turning the page is enough. The night after Daniel walked out of that boardroom, I returned home, placed my bag on the table, and stepped onto my balcony. The lake shimmered like liquid glass beneath the dusk sky. A soft breeze moved through the trees. Everything felt still, uncomplicated. I stood there for a long while, thinking not about him or them, but about her, the girl in the hospital bed. Eyes barely open, heart bruised alone, in a room where no one spoke her name with love. The girl who heard her parents bargain for her life, like it was nothing more than a technical solution to someone else's problem. She didn't have power. She didn't have a voice. But she had a heartbeat. and that was enough to begin. I kept thinking about that, how close I came to disappearing, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. They were ready to erase me, to decide that my story was over before it had truly begun. But I didn't let them. Not by fighting, not by yelling. I lived. That was my rebellion. I didn't live to prove anything. I didn't need to be famous or feared or forgiven. I just wanted to choose what to love, who to trust, how to breathe without shame. And I had. A week later, I received an email from the hospital. The Clara's heart bill had officially passed into state law. The subject line read simply, "It's done." Attached was a photo of the signing ceremony, smiling legislators, staff members, and in the middle, a small printed plaque with my name on it. They had done it. Not just for me, but for every young person who might find themselves powerless, voiceless, caught between obligation and survival. I printed the email and taped it to my fridge right next to a postcard from a former intern, and a quote that read, "The quietest voice can still echo." Later that week, another letter arrived. This one had no name on the envelope, but I knew the handwriting. My mother's. The letter was short, a single page, neat script. "Clara, we don't know where to reach you. We don't know who you are anymore. But we read the news, we saw your name, and we realized it's truly over. We wanted to ask for help, for understanding, for a bridge, but instead we'll say what we should have said a long time ago. We were wrong. We were terribly, terribly wrong. Your father is sick now. Daniel is lost in ways we cannot fix, and we have no one left. But if you are reading this, please know you were never nothing. We just couldn't see you. We hope you can forgive us, even if we don't deserve it. Your mother." I didn't write back, not out of anger, but because I had already said everything I needed to say with my silence, with my story, with my life. Some stories end with reconciliation. Mine didn't. It ended with freedom and beginnings. That night I lit a single candle, placed the letter beside it, and watched as the flame danced. I didn't burn it. I didn't keep it. I just let it rest there, a relic of a life I no longer carried. When people ask me now how I survived, I never tell them about the court filings or the legislation or the company I built. I tell them this: I listened to the girl inside me, the one no one else believed in, the one whose heart kept beating even when no one thought it was worth saving. I chose her, and every day since I've chosen her again. That's how I survived. That's how I live.